few weeks on from Jeremy Corbyn's election as Labour Party leader, we've begun to learn a little more about the new leadership's take on economic policy. On Monday, John McDonnell, Labour's new shadow chancellor, spoke to the party's annual conference, and he announced an economic advisory committee made up of prominent independent economists. In the studio with me to discuss this is Chris Giles, the FT's economics editor. Chris, let's start with this committee made up of 7 fairly prominent names. We know people like Piketty, Stiglitz. These are sort of household names on the centre-left and further left even, but solid economists, well respected, even if they're not without their critics. This is a good idea, isn't it, to have a committee of serious thinkers to help making sure you don't make any mistakes when you want to be a radical?
It's clearly a good idea to have external advice from smart people. In fact, every opposition has done this since as far back as I can remember. I remember being in a lecture once, and Professor John Eatwell came in, and he'd just been advising Neil Kinnock. And these things happen. You get people who are fellow travellers. Politicians want them, opposition politicians want them. The economists want to raise their profile. There's quite a match there, and it works quite well. Sometimes George Osborne had it when he was Shadow Chancellor himself. So it is a good idea. Really, we have to see how much influence they have. They're only going to meet once every 3 months. And I think it's more trying to stop the Labour Party doing something really stupid.
Probably one thing is exactly to kind of cut off the sillier ideas before they make it into manifestos and official policy platforms and so on. The generous view is that these are people who are associated with challenging what has been the mainstream policy in many countries since the crises. These are people who are anti-austerians, but with some intellectual weight to give to that position. So the generous view, I would think, is here are people who do want to offer a serious alternative to current economic policy. These are the sort of people you want advice from.
The one thing they've all got in common, really, is that they are, I don't like the word austerity, but they're not into, what they don't like is efforts to cut budget deficits, particularly at the moment. Some of them don't like it when the economy is doing badly, and when the economy is doing well, they just don't like cutting budget deficits as a government policy, even when they're extremely high. And I think that's the one thing they've got in common.
That's true, and that's quite interesting, because that's not actually quite what the new Labour leadership position is shaping up to be. So we've now heard John McDonnell's speech to the conference, and at least what I take from this is that they try to, if not quite match, but at least show that they're serious on cutting the deficit. They want to do it by raising taxes rather than cutting spending.
Well, actually, I don't quite agree with that. I think that John McDonnell is really trying to triangulate the issue in a classic Blairite way, saying it's not that, I have a third way. I mean, he could almost be Tony Blair in this speech, although what his third way is rather different. He's sort of saying, in effect, the big thing he's saying is we don't need to cut public spending because we can, to use his words entirely, dynamically grow the economy.
Yes.
So he's saying that his other policies will be so successful at creating growth that tax revenues will flood in, and that's how the deficit will go, because he wants to keep the deficit reduction target. He's just saying we don't have to cut public spending to do so. The one thing he is wanting to cut is something he calls corporate welfare.
Yes.
This is quite an odd concept, because it's not like welfare given to people, because companies aren't things that get money. They're sort of intermediaries that might be given subsidies, but they will often pass them on in lower prices. So,
well, they may or may not. That depends on the competitive structure.
Of course it does. Of course it depends on that. But what would you say? I would say most of it will get passed on, and it won't go in profits to the shareholders, which are people after all.
I'm sure that will depend on the sector we're talking about. But I think what it all means, being anti-austerity means we'll do things in a way that don't hurt you so much, they say to their supporters. Of course, that's what all politicians say. But just on the substance, I mean, the idea that a little bit less deficit cutting will allow the economy to grow faster may be right, may be wrong, but it's not obviously wrong, and a lot of economists think this. But the big point is that they want to do a lot more of the deficit cutting also by raising taxes rather than cutting spending. I mean, isn't a fair way to look at this to say just that they want to do a sort of Scandinavian model? UK taxes are low, why not raise them?
Well, on one sense, yes, they're a traditional tax and spend Labour Party. They want to have higher spending and higher taxes relative to the Conservative Party. Scandinavian countries clearly have higher taxes and higher public spending. They also have a very efficient underlying economy, and that's where we haven't heard much from John McDonnell, because he actually seems to want, in some sense, there's a lot of talk about what I would say is creating inefficiencies in the economy, so some of the nationalisation and higher wages, and there's a lot of things in there where we have to think that maybe this isn't the way of getting a competitive, dynamic economy, but with higher taxes.
Well, that's going to be the very interesting thing to see. There is clearly some tax and spend that sounds a bit old-fashioned here, but there seems to be at least a promise of offering something a little bit more modern. We'll see. For now, thanks very much, Chris.